right, welcome to your first lecture of the term here. This first module is all about a review of foundational concepts for A&P. These are all concepts that if you've taken 215, you probably went into more detail, but it is important that if you haven't taken 215, that we go over some of the basic stuff that you're going to need to understand to move forward with the rest of the organ systems. And honestly, even if you've taken 215, this is a really great refresh. So we are going to start with anatomical position. So if you stand in anatomical position, you're standing with nice and straight and tall. You're standing with your arms at your sides and you're having your palms out. Your feet are just facing forward in a relaxed state. Now, this anatomical position is very important because every time we refer to directional terminology or referencing from a body part or something in that respect, this is the position we always go back to. And what a lot of people don't realize is that those palms are forward. And so your front and your back become maybe not what you would typically associate your front and back with. The other thing I want to note with anatomical position is that it is that person's left and right. So if I'm looking at this individual on the screen, the left side of the screen is actually his right side, whereas the right side of that picture is his left side. So if we ever talk about right and left, you always want to reference your patient's right and left. So that's something I really want to make sure that we understand. Now, directional terminology, and I review this because you're probably going to hear me say this a lot in future lectures. And they go with opposites. So for anterior versus posterior. So for example, anterior versus posterior will be front versus back. Okay, and I'm going to show you an image with all of these on it. Medial versus lateral. Okay, medial is towards the midline. And if you imagine this midline, it's going to be a line straight down the middle of your body, essentially, if you cut your body in half. Lateral is going to be anywhere away from that midline. So here's my midline. And if I'm over here, I'm like my ear, I'm going to be lateral. Proximal and distal is something that you're going to talk about when you're talking about limbs. So upper arms, lower legs. And the reference point for those is going to be point of attachment. So if you think about your arm, your point of attachment is your shoulder. And if you think about your hips, your point of attachment, or excuse me, your legs, your point of attachment is the hips. So if we are talking about a location on your arm, and we want to talk about proximal versus distal, we're saying how close proximal or distal, how far away a reference point is to that point of attachment or to that shoulder. So for example, if you're comparing your elbow to your wrist, for example, so if you say my elbow is what to my wrist, it's going to be proximal, closer to, because this is your point of attachment and your elbow is closer to your shoulder than your wrist is. Okay, and distal will just be the opposite. So your wrist is distal then to your elbow. Superior and inferior is going to be top and bottom, so above or below. Cephalic and caudal we don't typically use with humans, but cephalic is towards the head and caudal is towards the tail. It's more of like a animal, like a non-human mammal terminology. Superficial and deep is important when we talk about like dissection or going inside the body, not just the superficial structures. So as you peel back layers, as you're getting into the body, into the organ systems, you're going deeper. So superficial is going to be towards the surface. As we go deep inside that structure, now we're deep. So this image is from your book. This is all of the anatomical directions that we talked about. So for example, if we have superior and inferior, those are typically easy ones. So here's superior is above. Inferior is below. So if we want to say, for example, her neck is superior to her belly button, right? So her neck is above her belly button and she's in anatomical position. Notice how her palms are facing outward. She's standing nice and straight and tall, feet are forward. All right, so if you say that her neck is superior to her belly button, you could also reverse it and say her belly button is inferior or below her neck. Okay, let's talk about medial and lateral. So here's that imaginary midline that I was talking about. And if we're close to that midline, we are medial. If you are farther away from that midline, you are lateral. So think about what are some of the most medial structures of your body. Okay. How about your nose? Your nose is right on that midline, right? Your mouth, pretty darn close to that midline. Your sternum, your chest bone here, your belly button, right? Your pubic bone, all of those things are very medial. Now, as we move away from that, now we're going to be lateral. So your shoulder, your arm, your pecs, those types of things are lateral to anything on this midline. Proximal and distal, notice how they have those labeled on the arm and the leg. So your point of attachment here is going to be your shoulder and your hip. So if we're proximal, we are towards that shoulder. If we are distal, we are away from that shoulder or towards the fingertips. And then if we're talking about the leg, if we're proximal, we are towards that hip. And then if we are distal, we are towards the toes. So again, let's do another example. If you want to say the ankle is what to the knee, right? So your ankle is distal to your knee. Your ankle is farther away from the point of attachment than your knee is. Okay, and then lastly, we have that anterior posterior. This is a one that we use quite a bit, especially with muscles. But we talk about anterior being the front of the body and posterior being the back. And ventral and dorsal, you can also use those, but you'll hear me specifically use anterior and posterior. And anterior is just towards the front, posterior is towards the back. And that's if we did another imaginary line right down the middle, splitting her into a front half and a back half. So if you want to reference something like that, you might say that the shoulder blade or the scapula is posterior to the sternum or the breastbone, right? So it's towards the back compared to the breastbone or the sternum. You need more examples of these, they are in your book. I'm not going to go through all of these major body regions, but there are some things that you just should be aware of. When I lecture, I always talk in anatomical terms. And so I just want you to be aware that these things exist. Again, if you've taken 215, you may have touched on a lot of these in detail. But some major ones that I just kind of want to draw your attention to are going to be the arm for sure. When we get into vessels, blood vessels, we're going to talk about the blood vessels of the arm. And I'm going to say things like brachial region, antecubital region, antebrachial region. And all that means is that when you're in anatomical position with your palm out, this upper area here of the arm, like where they would put a blood pressure cuff, for example, is the brachial area of the arm. This middle kind of bend of your elbow is called the antecubital, or literally means front of elbow. Cubital is the elbow. And then down here, we have the forearm, which is called antebrachial. So those are going to be important to know. Also here, I talk about femoral a lot, especially when we get to blood vessels of the leg. I may say crural or crus, which is front of the lower leg. Sural is back of the lower leg, or sura. Popliteal is a good one to know. That's the back of the knee. Other ones that I may hit on. Not too many of these in detail, I would say, but if we go on, I'm going to hit on the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity quite a bit. So this axial cavity or axial area is going, when we talk about axial, let me back up. If we talk about axial, we're talking about head, neck, and trunk. So it's kind of like your core, right? Anything attached to that are going to be appendages. So your upper appendages and your lower appendages, your arms and your legs. So the axial region is head, neck, trunk. In this case, we're going to be mainly talking about the trunk a lot in this class. Appendicular are going to be the appendages. We're going to call those kind of like the peripheral. So this is kind of central. This is more peripheral out here. And then Obviously, because we're doing cardiovascular and respiratory system, digestive system, all of that, we're going to talk a lot about the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. And something to keep in mind is that the split between the thorax and the abdomen is actually the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is your breathing muscle right here, right below your ribs. So if you all just kind of feel out your rib cage at where it's at the bottom, right? Your diaphragm sits right under there, and above the diaphragm then, where your rib cage is, your heart, your lungs, that's all thoracic. And below that, up until your pelvis, like pubic bone, is going to be the abdomen and then the pelvic area. And in this case, we're going to combine the two and just say the complete abdominal pelvic cavity and combine it all in one term. Okay, let's review levels of organization. So if we talk about levels of organization, I'm not going to go into detail here again. A lot of this comes from a general bio class, a general bio class or a chemistry course. But essentially the simplest unit of all living things is a cell, or at least for biology, it's a cell, right? But we have to think about what cells are made of, and they're made of things called macromolecules, which are made of molecules, which are made of atoms, which are those things on your periodic table from a chemistry course, right? So we have atoms or individual elements, essentially, and they are building up molecules. They're combining to form structures called molecules made up of multiple different kinds of atoms. Multiple molecules get together and form what we call a macromolecule. Macromolecule would be like your protein, for example. So multiple proteins make up a cell, and a cell is the simplest unit of a living organism in terms of like a tissue. So here's your cell with your nucleus, right? Multiple cells, and this is a cardiac cell, for example, or the heart. Multiple cells are going to make up what we call a tissue. So this is myocardium. So this is going to be the muscle of the heart. All of this muscle combined forms your organ, which is your heart itself and blood vessels. Your heart plus all the blood vessels of the body create this organ system. In this case, we call it the cardiovascular system, because we're not only talking about cardio, which is your heart, we're also talking about all of the vessels, the arteries and veins and capillaries. So that's going to be the vascular part. And then multiple organ systems make up your organism. Okay, so it's just kind of working from the most simplest level of organization to the most complex. And we, as a human being, are the most complex. Okay, so just basic functions of these organ systems. We're not going to go into huge detail until we get to them each week, but just to kind of recap, from BIOL216, if you've had it or if you're going to take it, you will talk about 4 systems. You will talk about the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. And major functions, okay, body covering, obviously, like protection. That's the integumentary system. That is your skin. Your skin is the largest organ that you have. Okay, support and movement, that's going to be your skeletal and your muscular system. Makes sense, right? So your skeletal bones and the muscles all work together to be able to move and then also support you in an upright position. Integration and coordination, that's going to be your nervous system, and then another system we're going to talk about in a second. But integration and coordination, okay, think about chemical messages being sent throughout the body. Okay, so we know that the nervous system fires nerve impulses, right? So that's going to be integration, coordination, sending those messages to make something happen. Now, this term, we are also going to talk about another integration coordination system, which is called the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is like your hormones, okay? And what the endocrine system is responsible for is adjusting your organ systems in order to maintain homeostasis. And we're going to recap on what homeostasis is here in just a little bit. But basically, they're going to do that by secreting chemical messengers, which are your hormones. Now, the endocrine system and the nervous system have a lot of similarities in terms of cell-to-cell communication. There are some differences, but they're very relatable in terms of how they communicate. And then these hormones, these chemical messengers, are going to then alter the cell metabolism in order to maintain a stable internal environment. So we'll get into that. But just looking at this image here, these images are all going to show you all the organs that make up the organ system. So here you can see kidneys, you can see a pancreas, you can see the brain, right? So those organs are making up an organ system. And then all of those organ systems, if we were to lie them all in the same individual, then we would have an organism, right? All right, so if we keep going here, the two systems that are responsible for transportation of substances, that's going to be your cardiovascular system and your lymphatic system. So on the left here is going to be the cardiovascular system. And not only do we have our organ called the heart, but we also have all of our blood vessels, which also function as an organ because it's made up of tissue. And our heart plus our blood vessels makes up one system. So that's going to be our cardiovascular system. Oops, excuse me. Lymphatic system is going to be another one that we don't always think about with transport, and a lot of people aren't even super familiar with the lymphatic system, and we are going to get to it this semester or this term. But your lymphatic system has to do with immunity and movement of fluid, interstitial fluid specifically, which is fluid that kind of sits in your tissues. The best example I can give would be like edema. So you've all seen somebody's like feet swell or ankles swell because of their circulation maybe isn't so great. Well, the lymphatic system is responsible for draining that fluid back to the heart, and so it doesn't accumulate there. So we'll get into that a little bit deeper. What it also does is has a function in immunity. So you can see that there's the purple spleen there, and then there's also this gland right in the chest called the thymus gland, which maybe a lot of you have not heard of, but those things are going to transport antibodies and pathogens accordingly to initiate immune response. Okay, so transport. If we go on here, oh, now we don't want to, there we go. The three systems that we have here that are responsible for absorption and excretion. So we have digestive system, respiratory system, and urinary system. And respiratory system, a lot of people associate with the same function as cardiovascular, but it's actually not that way. The respiratory system and cardiovascular system feed off of each other, but they have very different functions. And so if we're talking about absorbing nutrients, obviously that's going to be the digestive system. So the digestive system is going to break down the food that you eat into small molecules that we can then utilize as energy for our cells. Excreting wastes, same thing, right? So defecation is part of the digestive tract. Respiratory system is responsible for air movement, absorbing oxygen from the air we breathe into the bloodstream, right? Excreting carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cell metabolism. So keep that in mind. The urinary system it absorbs some things. I wouldn't necessarily call them nutrients, but it does absorb things that your body needs. It also excretes wastes that your blood doesn't need. And then most importantly, your urinary system plays a vital function in water and electrolyte balance. So maintaining fluid balance, a good example is your blood pressure, right? So if your blood pressure is too low, you might be dehydrated, right? And so your kidneys aren't going to excrete as much water. You're going to hang on to that water because your body needs it. And therefore that you're going to urinate less. So that's a good example. And then the last system that we have would be the reproductive system, and that's its function is just reproduction. So we have a male and a biological male, biological female here represented. Your main function here is producing offspring, right? That's the goal of the reproductive system. That's the goal. That's the evolutionary goal of sex, is to produce offspring, to pass on your genes, to diversify the gene pool. So we have lots of cell division going on here. We're producing gametes, which are your sperm and your egg. And then also there are some hormone secretions. So you will see these anatomical parts also in the endocrine system as well. And that's a really important part that I should make, or point that I should make, because a lot of these systems are integrated with each other. So you may see similar organs in multiple systems playing a role, which is really, really a miracle. It's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to stop there for this video. Go ahead and take a quick break, and when we come back, we will start with homeostasis.